love you guys, and I also want to wring your neck. So medically, one could declare him a psychopath.
That psycho, Lauren D. Laguna, does that all the time.
I want to create a place where people are like, oh wow, Lauren is the place I could go to express my idea that is difficult, where I might be shut down in other places. I want a free speech channel.
It is Lauren D. Laguna. I fucking knew it.
Hey, how are you, Dr. Stephen Kent?
I am still alive, so
I am so excited to be here with Dr. Stephen Kent, and you work as a professor in Canada, and you teach sociology, and specifically focusing on cults. Is that correct?
yeah. I retired just end of December. I was a sociologist of religion who concentrated on groups called sects and cults and alternative religions.
Congratulations on your retirement. That's so exciting. And you're up there in Canada.
It's when I was teaching, I really couldn't write. And now I'm just trying to write. There's just so much in my head that I want to get out. So it doesn't feel like I'm retired.
That's awesome. That's great. So we were going to be talking about, hey, Punky, we're going to be talking about cults and all of that today. But before we get started, I want to just know a little bit about you. What's your background? Like, how did you get started in this? Where did you grow up? So yeah, where did you grow up?
Yeah. Well, I grew up in and around Baltimore, Maryland, in the States. Entered university in 1969, University of Maryland. In 1970, my campus blew up. Maryland was one of the many universities and colleges protesting the American invasion in Cambodia. So we had riots, tear gas, National Guard, and so on. By the time I graduated in 73 with a bachelor's in sociology, a major cultural shift had happened. Political dissent had died down, and it's seemingly in its place. A raft of gurus and swamis and enlightened masters and spiritual teachers were flooding the youth market, and I didn't understand what was going on. And I went to as many talks as I could. Graduated in 73, as I said, and then drifted around for a couple of years in odd jobs. Worked at I was a very bad cook. I tried. I really did try. And I worked in a conference center and was a counselor for mentally challenged people and so on. Went back to graduate school in 1975 at American University in Washington, and had been accepted in a program in English Bible. But I walked into the office, and they announced that there was an announcement for a new program in Hinduism. So I changed just on the spot, essentially, and then got a master's in Hinduism. And before it was finished, I had moved to McMaster University in Canada, in Ontario. Hamilton, Ontario is about an hour-ish, I guess, southwest of Toronto, and got a second master's and then a PhD, also in religious studies. But it was a social sciences of religion program. I studied 17th century Quakerism, 17th century religious sectarian groups. But
do you have a particular religion yourself, or do you just study other people's religions?
At the time, I was deeply involved with Quakerism. I'm not involved with any groups right now. We can talk about that later. But the theoretical material that I used to study the sectarian groups like Quakers in the 1650s was the current material coming out on so-called new religions in the 1970s. So that was my foundation. I got a postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Alberta in Alberta, Canada. Moved out there for 2 years. Was a sessional for 1 semester. I applied for a big grant to the Canadian government to study the movement of sectarian groups between the U.S. and Canada. I got the grant, and that's what kicked off everything. There was this is before the this is 1986. Before the internet, I would go to newspaper indexes, find articles on a number of groups I was studying, find people's names, go to the phone book, call them up, and I spent in one case just months traveling around in Canada, and then a lot of times in the States collecting. I know one trip I came back literally with a cart filled. I mean, filled. I don't think there's room for another piece of paper, filled with material I had gathered, books, articles, material people donated, and so on.
Wow.
And then, you know, as I talked to people, some of the people from some of the groups were telling me just incredible stories about abuse and violence and manipulation and control. They were hard to believe, really. In some cases, people tell me stories, and I say, can you prove that? In a few cases, people say, yep. They'd stand up, walk in another room, come back with a document, say, look, here's the document, here's the policy.
What's something, can you give like a specific example of something that you was like, that's too absurd to be real, and then they proved it?
Some of the early people, early on in my research had come out of Scientology. And they were telling stories often about incidents that happened against them, the perpetrators for whom couldn't be proven. A lot of suspicions and so on, but still they would bring policies and say, look, here's the policy. This is why I think. In their case, they were saying, I'm sure we know who did it. And then also they'd been through a lot of things where they did have policies where they were able to connect. So it's stories like that. And then at some point, one of the groups I'd studied had done a lot of child sexual abuse. And I'm sure I didn't know it when I started. But as I got deeper and deeper into the literature, and former members started telling me more, and in one case, I bought material from a group itself. I looked into here and said, "Oh my God, what is this?" And that exposure to the material about child sexual abuse, as well as the accounts that people were telling me about abusive things that they had seen in their groups, the manipulation, the control, the overwork, the terrible working conditions, the long hours, the financial sacrifices people have made, all those things combined that helped me gradually shift into focusing on abuse issues.
Wow. And you feel like you could speak openly about this now, but that's because you have insurance policy, right? Like you had to get an insurance.
The university was pretty good about protecting me. And I never got sued. I also try to be careful about what I say. Now, one can never stop somebody from suing. You can maybe stop somebody from winning, but it's very expensive. In one case, Scientology had accused me of being analogous to a Canadian-German Holocaust denier, a guy named Ernst Zundel. And what was going on was I was speaking about in a supportive fashion, Scientology's efforts to criticize Germany in Bavaria and other provinces. And Scientology's response is that I was like a Nazi in pre-World War II. I was supporting the oppression of a group, and hence it accused me of being
they're the Jews in this scenario.
I'm sorry?
They considered themselves like the oppressed Jews in this scenario.
Exactly. And interesting story. The Scientology has a publication called Freedom. Sometimes it was a newspaper, sometimes it was a magazine. And they distributed copies of a freedom newspaper around the University of Alberta community area. And I don't know, 1,500 miles away in Toronto, around where the University of Toronto was, because I guess they identified Toronto as the major academic institution in the country. And that's where they made the allegations about Ernst Zundel and me. So, you know, it was the first time, probably the first time I'd been slimed on the internet. And of course, I'm apoplectic because it was new and whatnot. Contacted lawyers and they said, look, it'll cost you $250,000 to fight this case. At most, you'd win maybe $30,000. And if something goes wrong, you lose everything. So essentially, it was suck it up.
Right. Yeah.
You know,
lawyers suck. We should all throw them in the fire.
Well, it was just, and part of what happened is that this Scientology newspaper had been distributed as an insert in Canada's major newspaper, in the Globe and Mail. So I, you know, launched a lawsuit against Globe and Mail, and we finally, of course, settled out of court. They did one of those careful retractions or qualifications that, you know, lawyers write, and then gave me an opportunity to write an editorial article on it. You know,
financial damages as well.
No, it cost me, I don't know how much it cost, but
oh wow.
But it was the first time that that something like that had happened, and then I, you know, kind of get used to it. You know, Scientology's got a page up about people who considers to be religious bigots and so on. I'm on that. Children of God launched a prayer effort against me. So
you imagine praying to a god to harm a human? Like, I don't think that's how praying's supposed to work. What do I know?
And I guess the prayers worked. I got old. I got old and got a bad hip. So
the alternative, as my dad likes to say, getting old is better than the alternative.
So it's been an interesting process. The other thing that happened, Lauren, and this is my own impression, is that another reason I got involved in the study of abuse and so on is that I did not find that my academic colleagues who were studying these so-called new religions, it's not a term I like, were avoiding the discussion about abuse. Mm-hmm. They were avoiding it because at the time a big debate was going on between, you might say, cults, supporters of new religions versus anti-cult people. And academics tended to, many of them, especially in religious studies and sociology, were defenders of these groups. You know, the assumption is, well, all groups have painful beginnings, and after a while they calm down. It's not, you know.
Well, I have a question about that because I'm Jewish, and obviously I'm Reformed. I'm not Orthodox. But then I look at the Orthodox Jewish religion, and it's clearly not a new religion. But it feels a little bit cult-like because of the whole, you're not allowed to leave, you have to marry within, there's all these very strict rules, you have to tell the rabbi when you're on the rag, you have to, like, it's very strict. So is it just because it's old and established? Is that what makes it not a cult?
A lot of literature has come out now, especially in the popular press, about abuse against women and children in various Hasidic traditions. Mm-hmm. That's where you really see problems. And in terms of the restrictive dynamics that go on in these Hasidic communities, it's every bit as abusive as some of the more modern and recent groups.
Mm-hmm.
So it's you bring up a good example about why I don't like the term new religious movements. A lot of the groups that are demonstrating abusive practices are not new. Many of these groups are either not religious or they are multi-dimensional, in which religion is only one part of a much larger set of behaviors and activities. A lot of these religions are businesses, pseudo-family structures, psychotherapies, alternative educational systems, and so on and so on. So to call it a religion glosses over all those secular aspects about what they really are. And there should be a debate about a difference between a movement and an organization. An organization is one large entity that can have many movements in it. So to call a group a new religious movement deflects a lot of precision about what's actually going on in these groups. Hasidim are involved in businesses. So to call it in that case, a movement might be okay. But if you look at a group like, say, Charlie Manson, there was just a single small group, you can't really call it a movement. So I don't like the term new religious movement. Now, a lot of people, no, a lot, some of us at times use the word cult, and that has a whole series of problems about it, And there's been a movement for decades by supportive academics not to use the cult word because they say it's pejorative, it's insulting, it's judgmental. To come up with a definition of cult, and you'll get different definitions. The one I use is that a cult is a group that uses undue influence to create obedience and dependency. That's it.
Okay, so a group that uses undue influence to create obediency and dependency?
Essentially, yes.
Okay.
Now, you can go and break down a whole lot about what is undue influence, what's obedience, what kind of dependency goes on, but it doesn't have to be religious.
I actually was going to ask you that, like, what are some non-religious cults? And I really wanted to get into some online cults that have been popping up and talk about that because we had discussed that previously, privately. And so what are some like non-religious cults, and what are some of the first non-religious cults that you know of or heard of?
The study of sectarian groups goes back I've got books from the late 1800s that identified what they consider different sects. But the actual study really took off in the early 1970s. Immediately prior to this time, however, at least one study was looking at political cults. All these Marxists and Stalinists and Bolsheviks that were fighting against each other, and you got the doctrine wrong, and Lenin said this. They weren't religious, but they had a lot of the same exclusivistic, encapsulated thought processes and hostile dynamics that we then started seeing in the so-called religious groups. Moreover, if you look at a group like, for example, the Unification Church, most popularly known as the Moonies, that group was involved and still is involved in a number of businesses. And if you're following the tragic events in Japan, it's also connected to Japanese politicians. So we see a lot. There's a ripe area for manipulation and control is in pseudo-therapy groups. Groups involved in deviant psychotherapy.
like for instance, if I looked up a therapy group online, then I might end up going to a group therapy session that's just a cult.
Oh yeah, we'll talk about some of the processes about how people get in, but the assumption is that ordinary therapy works 50 minutes once a week. So if you have ordinary therapy 2 times a week, it's twice as good. What about 3 times? What about 5 times? Let's all move in together and do therapy all the time. And that happens, right? So people implode.
Oh,
now,
no.
A therapist who's got odd ideas about how to make people whole, and they just do therapy all the time based around the leader's teachings. And people get screwed up.
Oh, no.
Yeah, and one of the attractions of a lot of groups, and probably it explains some of the attractions online, is that people need community.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
They need a sense of purpose, and they need meaning in their lives. These groups claim to give, and often do give, both meaning and purpose to individuals. Doesn't mean that the claims and purposes are, in some objective sense, real or true, but it means people internalize them and believe them. And once they're believed, it is as if they are real because they're real to the person.
Right. That's why I was so actually interested in reaching out to you, is because pretty much everyone here watching is part of a YouTube community, and there's all these different sections of YouTube that act like a community. And I believe, in my uneducated opinion, that some of these communities act like cults. One of them in particular, the members get chastised for leaving. If they do leave, they will be, do you know what doxing is?
Yeah.
So they'll have all of their information doxed. So I'm thinking of a particular group, and I kind of was hoping to get your opinion on this particular group, but they are a subsect of sovereign citizen. So
of sovereign citizens?
Yes.
So the anti-government movement.
Yeah. So what's your opinion on like sovereign citizens in general? And do you have those in Canada?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah, we've got them. They have not generally been as violent as the American versions. There was really extraordinary murder that happened within a sovereign citizen, either sovereign citizen or freeman. I'm not quite sure. He tracked down a retired tax judge in Ottawa and got entry to the guy's apartment, probably knocked on the door and murdered him. There was a police officer in my city of Edmonton a number of years ago who was delivering some sort of legal document to a person whose life had fallen apart and was online spouting these anti-government scenarios, shot through the door and killed the police officer. So, and there are some really, really off-center, way off-center movements in this country. There's a person called the Queen, or calls herself the Queen of Canada. There's a Ramona Didalo,
I guess.
And she travels around the country in motorhomes and Airstream trailers and so on. Thousands of followers who actually orchestrated an attack against a police department, I think in Peterborough, Ontario. So we've got these things. These people often, well, there's different interpretations about what happens. There are sovereign citizen gurus. And by the way, sovereign citizens go on in Canada, the US, the UK, Ireland, Germany has its own variations, Australia, New Zealand. So it's in variance in a movement around the globe.
And it's so hard to speak to them, though, because you try to say, like, well, you're a sovereign citizen. They go, no, I'm not. I'm not a sovereign citizen. And they changed it so they're a sovereign, or they're a this, or they're not a. And then they also claim not to be part of any community. It's very amorphous. But then they all preach the exact same ideas. But then there's also no, like, hierarchy or structure or organized group, and so they avoid saying that they're like a terror organization, because how could they be an terror organization if they're not an organized group? And
there is a community, though.
So there's a community, and there's a particularized guru, and he holds, so just like what we're doing now, this is called a panel. And if I wanted to, I could have up to 10 people up here arguing and yelling at each other. So every day he holds what's called a panel, and he'll let people up on his panel to talk to him. But it's usually like the same. There's like 20 or so guys, and they filter out, and some are more favored than others. But recently, if any of them have been disagreeing with him even slightly, he's been going out, finding their personal information, revealing it to the entire group. And then and sometimes I try to talk to these men, but a lot of the times they'll come to me and tell me how they're getting abused. And then they'll run right back to the group. And it's amazing. And they'll be like, I never spoke to her, and she's evil, and I hate her. And I don't get that. Why do they go back to the group? What's the hold?
The phenomenon of people leaving a group, sometimes denouncing it, and then returning, does happen. I can think of other examples. Part of the problem is that once they leave, they have no community at all. They lose those social networks. And as you point out, not only do they lose their old community, they're starting to get slimed publicly with private information and so on. And one of the interpretations is, oh, I guess I was wrong. They review this. If I look at the personal information that had been reviewed against me, it's my fault. So they go back. This loss of community, the power of a social network, a lot of these groups become what are called fictive families. It's like fictional families. If you listen to the language that a lot of religions use, it's family-based.
Father,
sister, brother.
He calls himself daddy.
Yes.
He calls himself daddy.
There you go. Keep in mind that a lot of people really come from tragic family backgrounds.
Oh, would you like to see a clip of one of these men getting, our producer would like to show a clip of kind of one of these men who left the group getting chastised for leaving the group.
You want to show it now?
Yeah, so Henry the producer can show that one. I'm hands-free. I'm a hands-free lady over here. I got a magic man in England who plays my clips. There we go. Oh yeah, I remember this.
Look, dude, I'm here to say, just please, just stop, man.
Please, well, stop what? I haven't talked about you. You're going on her show on Monday, she says. I've been done with you for a week. You all keep talking about me, punk pussy.
Hi, Lauren.
You all keep talking about me. You deleted your whole channel yesterday.
Yes, I deleted my channel.
You never apologized to me for everything you did and said. Get the fuck out of my face in life. Telling people public information is not doxing. Punk Howard, it's public record. If you don't like it, don't be a broadcaster.
He was like a here and should have brought it to like here.
The guy screaming, was he the victim or is he?
He's daddy.
He is the leader.
Yeah, so if you listen carefully, you could hear one of the men going, "You doxed me yesterday.
Yep,
I'm
okay,
sorry."
that was the guy. Yeah.
Yeah, and he was
It's very common. If you recall the recent case about Nixium in upstate New York, one of the things that Keith Raniere did was he got personal information by women that he held as, and he called it collateral, under the assumption that if they ever left him or did anything he didn't like, he threatened to reveal it. And it turned out, this was the group that branded women.
Oh, I did hear about this, but like one of the girls was a celebrity daughter or something, and she just kind of disappeared.
Yeah. Well, what happened? One of the people who got branded was a Canadian person, an actress. There's a lot of movie activity in Vancouver. She'd been a follower. She got branded, left the group, and became a devout critic. It turned out that the branding ceremony had been filmed, and it wound up on Mexican television. And I know that because I found it.
She was the one who did it.
Yeah, I found it because I was writing about Nixium, and I contacted her and said, I found this. I can either not cite it in my article or cite it. And we agreed that it was best not to cite it. But that's the kind of exposures that go on. And you'll see a lot of, in Scientology auditing, Scientology claims it's a confessional, like the Catholic priesthood. But there's good evidence and actual external proof that if people leave and become vocal critics, Scientology has gone back through people's auditing files, pulled out things they confessed, and made them public to discredit the individual.
Why don't the other Scientologists see this happening, going, wow, our church is talking shamak about this guy who just left, and it appears like they're using out his confessions. I should also refrain from confessing. Why does that connection not happen?
Yeah. Some people go through these so-called confessionals and they come out feeling better. Keep in mind that people carry around a lot of burdens, emotional, psychological burdens that are pent up inside of them. A process like auditing, which says we can get rid of the negative effects of that experience on you. Go through this auditing process, and the consequences of what happened or what you did will be gone, and people get hooked up to an e-meter, which is measures variations of electrical conductivity in the skin. And an auditor watches the e-meter, and they'll ask a question over and over again and see the meter jump. And eventually, and they're also trained not to be judgmental. An auditor cannot say, "You did what?"
Let's see if
what are you thinking. Yeah, so they can't judge. Consequently, there you go.
This is the e-meter.
Yep, and it looks scientific.
Where
it's supposed to only be used for religious ceremonies. It is at times used as a lie detector. It's a very primitive. It doesn't do. Pardon? Oh yeah.
Oh, okay. South Park did a thing on it.
Pardon?
South Park did a thing on. Do you watch South Park?
It's called Scientology claims that its auditing is confidential. It isn't, because of some of the reasons I expressed already. But they have something called security checks or sec checks. And the sec check puts people on the cans and says, this is not an auditing session. In other words, whatever you tell me is not confidential. And that material goes straight into leadership. If it's trying to discover if somebody is subverting the organization or holding negative thoughts about leadership and so on. So
how do you know if you, okay, people claim that these online cults, though, they're different than like Scientology, though, because Scientology, like, it's very personal. Like, they have your money, they know where you live, they know your family, they're in your neighborhood. So people claim like online cults, they're not, in fact, you can't even have an online cult. I actually spoke to an expert before I spoke to you who said online cults don't exist. So. Not
my understanding.
I mean, that same expert then quoted something from QAnon, and I was like, wait, did you just say online cults don't exist? But so what keeps you grasped in if it's online, if it's so distant?
Decades ago, if a person held unusual beliefs, that person would have to receive those unusual beliefs by pamphlets or a bookstore, or maybe go to a meeting. It was called the cultic milieu, and it was just a hodgepodge, a toxic mix of all kinds of odd ideas and belief systems. Now, those odd ideas and belief systems are embedded in the internet, and people get into them through algorithms. So you look up one thing, maybe something about that's critical of the government. Algorithm picks that up and then sends you some topics that you might like, and you get slowly drawn into the rabbit hole. And once you're in that rabbit hole, you connect with a lot of other people who believe similar things and also hold different ideas. So what you find is that if a person holds one set of ideas that are off center, very common they hold many ideas that are similarly odd because they've been drawn in. And there's only so many hours in a day. A person thinks that they are doing the research. Right? What's the QAnon phrase? Do your research. Well, they think they're doing their research because they've got all this information that reinforces their odd belief systems, and they have a community that reinforces the belief systems as well. I bet if you looked at the people in somebody's daddy group, they've had a lot of problems. Financial, family, employment problems, and being a sovereign citizen gives them a sanctity to be aggressive against the social system in which they haven't fit in.
Have you noticed a large overlap of like sovereign citizen people and flat Earth people? Like,
it wouldn't surprise me. I haven't seen that one.
Every flat earther I've met has ended up being a sovereign citizen, and every sovereign citizen I've met, not every, but most sovereign citizens I've met has been a flat earther.
Well, there's an anti-science strain that lays us through almost all odd beliefs, alternative beliefs. You saw it in the big reaction against COVID vaccination. And it transferred into.
We could disagree with that all day. And I actually, the last stream before this, had an anti-vaxxer that I agreed with. So we could go back and forth on that all day. I personally just don't think the COVID stuff was tested long enough, and I feel safe saying that on this platform because my anti-vax stream didn't get demonetized.
But Laura, it seems basic. It was an airborne disease transmitted through the air. And so the scientific reaction about masks and so on made sense. So you can debate how effective they were and whatnot. And also vaccinations just ramp up the body's ability to create antibodies. People are saying natural antibody systems and so on. Well, the vaccination just kick-started it. So my sense, And also, but a lot of people who were involved in the anti-vaccine movement were deeply religious. And what you had is a challenge to religion. If we accept the authority of science, then the potential exists to undercut religious beliefs that are based upon non-testable, non-experimental results. Now, science changed different directions in many ways throughout the COVID perspective. They're different. The anti-vax movement really began well before the COVID.
Yeah.
In Canada, for example, there was a very conservative Dutch reform group. They followed John Calvin's predestination doctrine. Predestination is some are saved by God at the beginning of time, everybody else is damned, and we can't do anything about whether we're saved or damned. So in the 90s, these community members from Canada were flying over to the Netherlands, visiting their fellow religionists that weren't vaccinated, coming back. They brought back polio with them.
Oh, wow.
Because a vaccination interfered with God's plans. So we've had, and then I was on a dissertation committee about a student who studied, it's quite amazing. She did research in the tribal areas of Pakistan. And there was all kinds of anti-vax scenarios in Pakistan about polio vaccination was a plot by the West to kill Muslims and so on. Yeah. So, there's a lot of fear about science and misunderstanding about what science is. But it fits a pattern. Science is a problem for people who have alternative beliefs. It's complicated to learn. It changes around. People don't have none of us know science. Lauren, I can't explain to you how this whole internet thing works, right? You're using it. I don't know. I can't even figure out how an electrical switch works. So we all assume a lot about science and don't know about it. These people who reject science live in a scientific world, don't realize they do, but only accept what reinforces their belief systems.
Yeah. Yes. I here's where I'm going to push back on you a little bit, because just as somebody obviously Jewish, and my grandma survived the Holocaust, so I can have a healthy disdain of government. And then I have a math degree. And the only reason that matters is that I have a healthy love for science and I know how to read basic scientific papers. And so, however, so the whole vaccine stuff, when you mix government with kind of forced medical care, and then you also look at like the Tuskegee experiments and you see how government kind of has used science as a weapon. And then you look at other things during COVID, such as you had a bunch of doctors that you know for a fact lied about the COVID lab leak and plenty of other things. So I can understand where people are getting that, like, oh, like, I'm not going to just trust some guy because he's in a lab coat. I'm not going to just trust some guy because he's the president or whatever. So I understand that healthy disdain, but at the same time, I can also see how that could lead to cult-like beliefs and behaviors that are not true.
Well, if you want to see the impact about anti-COVID positions in the Jewish community, look at the impact it had in some of the Hasidic groups. I mean, as you know, the Hasidic groups have very elaborate, intense celebrations, a lot of singing, dancing, drinking, and so on. They're just, they were vectors for transmission of COVID. And a lot of Hasidic communities got really sick because they ignored, health requirements. That's a pattern that happened in a lot of fundamentalist extremist religions. Look at the number of extremist religious preachers who died from COVID. Don't believe it. God will take care of me. They've been cleansed by the Spirit, and they caught COVID and died. So look, people lie. Politicians lie. But not all politicians lie. Not all science is bad. Most scientists are trying to follow the rules. We get it wrong sometimes, but good science corrects itself. These ideologues don't. They can't.
I think a lot of those religious people, because as somebody who just like, I listen to podcasts, and so I listened to some rabbis and I've listened to a couple of priests talk on this. I don't think they were saying they didn't believe in COVID or that they didn't believe that they could get COVID. I think what they were saying is that God is the most important thing to them, and God is eternal, and God is everlasting beyond this lifetime. So whatever happens in this lifetime is God's plan to them. And so for them, they wanted to continue practicing their religion no matter what was happening, because they want to practice their religion. Because that's how you honor God, and honoring God is the most important thing in the world.
If you look at the current situation about religion in the world, the major religions all formed in pre-scientific periods. You know, Judaism goes back, I don't know, what, 3,000 years in various forms, Christianity too, Islam for 1600, Hinduism goes back for long periods, Buddhism, 2,600 years. All of them were formed in pre-scientific eras. In these eras, people had no alternatives to explain the world other than religious ones. Moreover, in human history, I forget how long recorded human history goes back. I'm guessing maybe 5,000 years to the Babylonians and so on. Humans have been practicing religion probably into Neanderthal times. So the practice of religion greatly predates science and even the written language. If you look at modern religions, almost none of them survive. Almost all of them died. The ones that have started in a scientific period.
You think Scientology will survive?
No, Scientology won't. It's growing. It's getting smaller. There'll always be a few hangers-on. So there always will be some diehards who pick up a Dianetics book and go, "This is it." There's a great story. In the early 1960s, in the British countryside, two Jehovah's Witnesses knocked on a farm door. A woman answered and said, "Hi, we'd like to talk about our religion." And she said, "You don't want to talk to me. Talk to my husband." And they sat down with the husband, and I think an hour and a half later, they came out shaking their heads going, "What was that?" These Jehovah's Witness preachers had discovered the world's last Muggletonians. The Muggletonians were a religious group in the same period the Quakers emerged in the 1650s, and believed that their follower, Lodowick Muggleton, was one of the final trumpeters of the end of days. He had a partner. Partner died. Now, Muggleton was the final prophet. He had followers, but he said, "You can't preach this religion. If somebody wants to talk to you about religion, you can talk about it. You can't preach." And what happened was the Muggletonians stayed within family groups. And over a process of 300 years, they got smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. In the Second World War, this farmer would make runs of apples from his farm into London. So he'd load up boxes of apples, drive into London, and the Muggletonian library was in London. And every time he had empty carts, he'd fill it up with Muggletonian books and drive them out to his barn. He had an entire collection of 300 years of Muggletonian material that these Jehovah's Witnesses stumbled onto. They told their director. The director called the local university, and now the British Library has 300 years of Muggleton, but it took 300 years for this group to die.
Wow.
It died. And this the new religions die. The exceptions, if you look at the modern religions, the only two I can think of that have seemed to survive from the 1830s was Mormonism and Baha'is from the 1840s. Mormonism may be declining in the U.S., although it's growing in non-Western countries.
I have so many questions about Mormonism because there's different sections, right? Are some sections better than others? Because like I don't want to say the wrong one, but is it the LDS? There's one of them. There's a polygamist version, right?
That's fundamentalist LDS.
Okay, fundamentalist
LDS. From the Mormons, really separate themselves from the fundamentalist LDS. There's a doctrinal similarity. And there's an historical similarity, but fundamentalist LDS broke off from mainstream Mormons certainly by about the 1890s. And Mormonism has had over 200 sectarian fragments of splinter groups, and a lot of them are polygamist. And it's got a very complicated history.
So, right, with these polygamy groups, I've kind of been watching this reality TV show, Escaping Polygamy, a little bit. Have you seen that or know what it's about?
I worked and published on polygamy a number of years ago, and I thought, I'm done. I've done enough. I thought I pretty much knew what's going on. Now, whatever I say, I know what's going on. I learned something that tells me I don't know what's going on, but I haven't followed these contemporary shows too much.
Oh yeah, it's just amazing. It's like every episode, which you would think filming is like once a week. There's a new girl that is in a horrific, like 13-year-old about to get married off to her cousin, you know, or her uncle, and you're just like, excuse me, like and going to be like the 14th wife to your cousin, and it's difficult to, and then the exclusion is really the most painful part, especially because it's so familial. Like, so like, for instance, if your mom is the third wife of some guy and she has 12 kids and you want to leave, you're never going to see your siblings again. So you stay just so you can keep with your siblings. But if you stay, then you have to get married into the group, and then it just keeps going.
When I started studying polygamy, I didn't realize the implications for young men. Everybody appropriately talks about the impact upon young women, these young women who wind up being child brides or young brides of much older men. There was a case in, I think it was Colorado City, Arizona. There are two Mormon fundamentalist communities right on the border of Arizona and Utah. And in one of them, a young boy was driving somewhere in his pickup truck, and a young girl was walking home. He gave her a ride, and just for giving her a ride, he got beat up. His uncle, who was, I believe, also a cop, a local cop, and a couple other men beat him up because young men are a threat to the ability of the older men to get young brides.
Yeah, in the show they talked about it briefly. It looked like once the men hit a certain age, it was either they got a bride, like their first wife, or they were exiled from the community. And it seemed like the majority of the boys ended up having to get exiled because obviously you're going to have 50% women, 50% men, and each man needs like 9 wives. So about 10% of them stay, and then the rest of the 90% of the men get excommunicated. And because they don't have, a lot of them, at least from the show that I saw, became homeless because they didn't learn any life skills because they grew up in this cult, and then they get thrown to the streets and they don't have any education, they don't have any family to help them with finances.
It's a nightmare. I don't know the percentage of men who stay in versus men who leave, but and also if the men have experience, the young men have experience, it's sometimes through what appears to me to be forced labor. Oof. So one of these groups has a very elaborate house building company. So you learn how to be a roofer, but you're underage doing it. And these polygamous communities can undercut local businesses because they have cheap workers.
Yeah, children are workers. That's why farmers used to have a lot of kids. But then how did they get away? How do these groups get away with all of this? Because I know, like, if it's your third wife, they just don't get married by the state, right?
And also keep in mind that in these multiple marriages, a lot of the other wives to various degrees collude in the process of bringing in new young girls. They may not like it, they may feel threatened, but the older wives know what's going on. The issue is they deeply believe in the teachings that justify this kind of behavior, and the reason they get away with it is it's really hard to get external evidence. A lot of people in the community won't testify because they believe in the practice. They think it's an edict by God for a man to have multiple wives to allow them in higher realms of heaven, and the women become heavenly queens with their men in the afterlife and so on. So they've got an elaborate belief system. And then once again, it's the social networks and the physical threats.
Do you have any data on like the genetic effects of inbreeding in communities?
In Short Creek, Arizona, Short Creek, Utah, Colorado City. I get the which one is which. There's something called Fumarasi syndrome. It is a nasty genetic defect. People who are born with it and they have IQs maybe as high as or low as 30. They can't sit up. They can't talk. They can't eat by themselves. They die at very young ages, and it's entirely genetic.
How did they procreate to bring this, continue this genetic
What happens is that there geneticists have gone into the community. They know how it occurs. There's members from two old historical families. And so if ancestors of relatives of these two families merge, that's when the genetic mixture happens. And they've tried to talk to the community and say, look, don't have people from these two families marry. And one of the responses of leaders is, it's God's choice. They don't care. It is a nasty genetic defect that's preventable if they wanted to prevent it.
Well, they just think their sisters are cute. I don't know why you see a problem with that.
Yeah, it's God's. It's up to God.
Well, that has been interesting. So, I really appreciate your time here. I would love to talk again soon, especially if you want to check out specifically some of those channels that I think are cults, and if you ever want to come and do a deep dive with me.
Yeah, I'm always reluctant to label a group a cult, especially if I haven't studied it. Now, you can gather with my definition about creating obedience and dependency. I'd say a lot of groups are manipulative, but finally, Lauren, it doesn't matter what the label is. It matters what these groups do. You can look at mainstream religions that have caused enormous amounts of harm through child sexual abuse, financial mismanagement, and so on. That's the issue. Is harm is harm occurring? Can we take actions to end the harm? I don't care if a so-called cult's causing harm, or a church, or a political body. I don't care. It's the harm, the violation of human rights that's the real issue.
Very true. Yeah. And not even in a cult setting, we all need to watch our own actions and make sure we're not using any undue influence that we have to harm people or create controlled obedience. Well, thank you so much for being here, Doctor. Really appreciate your time.
Well, and as they say, live long and prosper.
Live long and prosper. All right. Have a good night. And we'll let Henry.
Thank you.